Welcome, everyone, to the Real News Network. My name is Maximilian Alvarez. I'm the editor in chief here at the Real News. And it's so great to have you all with us. We are recording this on Tuesday, September 13th, as the United States teeters on the edge of the first major rail shutdown in 30 years. At midnight on September 16th, unions representing railroad workers could initiate strikes, or the rail carriers themselves could begin initiating lockouts. As you all know, for the past 8 months here at the Real News Network, journalist Mel Buer and I have been extensively covering the long brewing crisis on America's freight railroads and all the different ways that corporate greed has wrecked the freight rail industry, has wrecked the supply chain, and has wrecked the lives of freight rail workers themselves. And, trying to get mainstream media or DC politicians to care about this vital issue has been like pulling teeth, even though the issue has been going on for a very long time. I mean, the stalled negotiations between the major rail carriers and the 12 different unions that represent rail workers have been going on for over 2 years. Those negotiations officially reached an impasse in late spring of this year, after which President Joe Biden appointed a presidential emergency board, which in late August offered its recommendations for an agreement between the two sides. While the rail carriers enthusiastically supported the PEB's recommendations, workers have many misgivings. And, frankly, things are moving very quickly. This video will probably be published on Thursday, just less than 24 hours ahead of the strike or lockout deadline. And, just this past weekend, ahead of the deadline for when lockouts could legally begin, the rail carriers began what many describe as a soft lockout by notifying customers and shippers of immediate carrier initiated slowdowns and embargoed freight. Meanwhile, the union leadership in 10 of the 12 railcraft unions have reportedly agreed to accept recommendations made by Biden's presidential emergency board as the terms of a new contract. But the membership still needs to have their say and vote on it. And we just got word that the union representing signalmen decided to not even put the PEB up for a membership vote as the framework for a tentative agreement. Again, this news is coming out quickly, and things may change by the time you see this video. But the relevance of the conversation we're going to have today is definitely going to last long after this week. Now, the two unions that have been standing their ground and rejecting the Presidential Emergency Board or PEB's recommendations, which collectively represent close to 60,000 engineers and conductors, are the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, or the BLET, and the Transportation Division of the Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers, or SMART TD. In a joint statement released this Sunday, Jeremy Ferguson, president of SMART TD, and Dennis Pierce, president of the BLET, said of the embargo, quote, "The railroads are using shippers, consumers, and the supply chain of our nation as pawns in an effort to get our unions to cave into their contract demands, knowing that our members would never accept them. Our unions will not cave into these scare tactics, and Congress must not cave into what can only be described as corporate terrorism." End quote. Now, on Monday, Republican Senators Richard Burr and Roger Wicker introduced a resolution in Congress to adopt the PEB recommendations to avert a national rail strike, essentially forcing workers to accept a contract without having the chance to vote on it based on the recommendations of the Presidential Emergency Board. It remains to be seen if Biden and the Democrats are going to have more than that to offer a beleaguered railroad workforce that, has been getting screwed for a long time and have pointed out that the supply chain is getting destroyed by corporate greed. And if workers themselves do not have the ability to strike, then they can effectively do nothing about this crisis. Now, if a resolution is not reached between the unions and the rail carriers, 12 a.m. on Friday the 16th could be the moment that strikes or lockouts begin around the country. Again, Congress could try to force a contract down workers' throats and compel them back to work for fear of the catastrophic economic damage that a shutdown could do. But the question is, will workers obey? To talk about all of this and more, I'm honored to be joined today by my guest, Matt Parker. Matt is a full time locomotive engineer who's been working on the railroads for 19 years. Matt also serves part time as chairman of the Nevada State Legislative Board of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today on The Real News.
Max, I'm honored to be here and thank you for having me here.
Well, it's greatly appreciated because I know that just by nature of your work, it's very hard to know, what your availability is going to be. And on top of that, we have all this chaos going on around us as we approach the deadline after which strikes or lockouts could occur this Friday. So again, I really, really appreciate you taking time out of your crazy schedule to chat with us. And, Real News viewers have been asking us to give updates on the situation after the live stream that we ran a week and a half ago, co hosted by Mel Buer. And we were talking to Ron Kamenko and Jeff Kurtz of Railroad Workers United. Of course, things have continued to develop since then. So we're going to dig into that. And that'll be kind of our main final update before the Friday deadline. So before we dig into all of that, Matt, I was wondering if we could start by just kind of getting to know a little more about you. Can you tell folks a little more about how long you've been working on the railroads and the kind of work that you do? And, for folks who are just now learning that there's a crisis on the railroads and are trying to figure out what's going on, talk to us a bit about what your kind of typical week looks like as a locomotive engineer.
Max, I've been working for the railroad since 2004. Before that, I had a long time association with a lot of railroaders. My best friend for 25 years was my brother-in-law. He was a career railroad employee hired out right out of high school. So I've been around railroaders and had some knowledge about the industry and previous labor struggles that goes back as far as 1985. I Since 2006, I have served in various capacities with the union. Presently, I have served as chairman of the Nevada State Legislative Board for the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen since 2013. Seen a lot of changes in the time that I've been out here, and that's an age-old story. I think that anybody who's been out here for any period of time can tell you. But particularly, what I've seen is the changes of the last 5 to 6 years have not been good. Uh, you've heard of this, what the railroads call precision scheduled railroading. I'm not going to justify it by calling it that. I'll call it Harrison railroading because it has nothing to do with either precision or scheduling. It's all about doing more with less. And one of the things that has come about as a result of that has been a massive reduction in the workforce now, which is having a detrimental effect on both three things really. It's having a detrimental effect on safety, it's having a detrimental effect on service, and it's having a detrimental effect on our working conditions overall. And really, with where we're at in this impasse right now, the feedback that I'm getting from the field is the dissatisfaction that the membership has with this has more to do with the working conditions than with pay and healthcare benefits, which are right up there at the top of the list also. Um, there's some unhappiness about those too, but overwhelmingly, what I see is just the complaints about the working conditions, which of course the PEB kind of kicked that can down the road and addressed some of it, but said these are issues that we feel should be addressed locally, and they're not addressed for us. And really, I think that's at the heart of where we're at, this impasse that we're at right now.
Let's talk about those changes to the industry that you're talking about, right? Because I think this is the thing that every railroader has, it's the first thing that every railroader I've spoken to has told me whenever I've talked to them about what's going on. The first thing they tell me is you need to understand this has been going on for a long time. And, to give folks kind of some perspective here, we're talking about an arc of almost a half century, right? From the 1980s when, deregulation kind of really took off on the railroads, this, led to a process whereby, close to 40 class one freight rail carriers existed around 1980. Now there are only seven, right? And so we have this kind of increasing oligopoly of the major freight rail carriers. At the same time, as Matt mentioned, the workforce on the railroads has been getting slashed repeatedly, having over 500,000 total employees in the rail industry around 1980 to now just having, around 130,000, right? And, since 2015 alone, the major freight rail carriers have collectively laid off over 30% of their workforce. And now they're complaining about a labor shortage that, in fact, they have caused. At that same time, as you mentioned, Matt, the other piece of this puzzle is that quality of service on the nation's freight railroads has been plummeting, while prices for that service have been going up and profits for the rail carriers have been going up. Stock buybacks have been, going up dramatically. And quality of life for workers on the railroads has also been plummeting. So, make all of this make sense. I guess like how is all of this happening, or why is it happening? I guess for folks who are just now kind of learning about this, how would you sort of explain to them why the industry has taken this course?
You mentioned the deregulation in the 1980s, and I think it's important to point out that that was economic deregulation. The railroads are still very heavily regulated in terms of safety, but not so much anymore in terms of service. There was a lot of relaxation on that in that act in 1980 that economically deregulated the industry. And that was necessary to save a lot of the industry that was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy at that time. What we see today is that that pendulum has swung the entirely other way, and it has become now a vehicle for Wall Street profit taking from the railroads at the expense of service. Very evident from number of hearings that have been taking place really since the fourth quarter of 2020, but particularly the Surface Transportation Board hearing earlier this year about service issues, where the four of the rail carriers, Norfolk Southern, CSX, BNSF, and Union Pacific, were all ordered to take certain steps to improve their service. There was an acknowledgement there that there's a big service problem with the railroads right now. So that's one issue that we see right now, and that's something that a lot of people need to understand right now, is that the carriers' lack of attention to service is, is driving problems with the supply chain, and it's in part driving inflation. This is why it's important for them to know that, be paying attention to it, be concerned about it. They're paying more and having more difficulty in getting goods because the railroads now, they're dictating the terms of service to their customers. They're not serving the customers. They're pretty much telling the customers, this is when you're going to get your freight. This is how you're going to get your freight. And the customers don't have any choice of what to do about it because, as you said, the oligopolies that have been formed at these railroads now. At the time that economic deregulation was enacted in 1980, there were 45 class one carriers in this country. Now we're down to seven, and that's likely to sink to six here, as it appears that the Surface Transportation Board is poised to approve the merger of CN and KCS. So if you're a rail customer and you don't like the service that you've got, in most cases, you're a captive shipper that you can't just take that business and go somewhere else. That's one thing that needs to be addressed. But again, it's been what we've seen through this Harrison railroading over the last 5 6 years, maybe a little bit more, is just cut, 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 and that includes the workforce. And in these hearings and in all these discussions, the hearings in the STB, the hearings in Congress, we've got another one coming up on Thursday, by the way. Chairman DeFazio of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has called another hearing to discuss possible service problems with agricultural product shipments during the harvest season. The railroads are blaming it on manpower. And as you pointed out, this is a situation they created themselves. They believed that they could cut their workforces to a certain level in order to reduce their expenses, to get their operating ratio down, and to reward their Wall Street masters more. And it has left them in this situation now where they don't have enough employees. More importantly, though, is that there's no sign that they're really taking any kind of serious action to correct that problem. And I honestly believe that what we're looking at here is incompetence of management, and the fact that these executives have now painted themselves into a corner with regard to manpower that they don't know how to get out of.
That right. I mean, I think that you put it perfectly, right? Again, just to kind of sum up for folks, like what we're looking at objectively here is a situation where, one of the most vital systems of moving freight in this country, and thus, like the nervous system of much of our economy has been driven into the ground by these top-down decisions that have led to a situation where quality of service and the amount of service itself has been plummeting for years, while quality of life for workers on the railroad has also been plummeting at the same time that prices for that service, profits made by the class one freight railroads, and stock buybacks and dividend payouts have been skyrocketing. So it really does seem like we're headed towards a disastrous direction, and in fact, the disaster in many ways is already here. I completely understand that folks who are learning about this issue now are understandably worried about what a rail strike or rail lockouts on Friday could do to the supply chain, a supply chain that has already been battered by COVID-19, by the war in Ukraine, by extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change. I understand that folks are worried about what it may do to prices at a time when inflation is still very high. But again, what I think people should understand, and what I hope our coverage of the railroads has shown, is that the supply chain is already in a crisis because of everything that we're talking about here. And as Matt said, none of this is really being addressed at the bargaining table. And the Presidential Emergency Board, when it offered its recommendations, essentially kicked the can on all of this stuff down the road. So let's talk about that for a second, Matt, because one thing that we've been really trying to emphasize in our reporting over the past year on the railroads, we do a lot of labor coverage here at the Real News, and most of the folks that we talk to, they are covered under the National Labor Relations Act. The railroads are not, right? The railroad labor relations on the railroads are governed by the Railway Labor Act. And, there's an important history there that we can't go into for viewers and listeners. But, a century ago, this country saw how much power workers have and how much workers could bring the national economy to its knees if they struck on the railroads. We're talking about the Great Railroad Strike of 1922, the Pullman Strike of 1894, and the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It was after those strikes that Congress passed the Railway Labor Act to essentially prevent, if at all possible, prevent a rail strike from happening. That is why we have been going through such a long, drawn out process to get to this point. That is why, after negotiations stalled, the Federal Mediation Board stepped in. The mediation board could not broker an agreement between the rail carriers and the rail unions, officially declaring an impasse in the late spring, releasing the two sides. The two sides were offered to enter into binding arbitration. They refused to do that. So that started a 30-day cooling off period, which is mandated in the Railway Labor Act. Then President Biden, as is his purview also detailed in the Railway Labor Act, appointed a presidential emergency board. That board met, assessed the situation, and offered its recommendations in late August, thus starting another 30-day cooling off period during which the rail carriers and the rail unions could look at the PEB recommendations. So when we talk about the deadline that we're approaching this Friday, that is the end of the cooling off period following the release of the PEB's recommendations. So, I'm sure Matt's bristling because I'm probably like kind of paving over some important details here, but I just wanted to make sure everyone watching and listening is keeping up with us. And Matt, I wanted to ask if you could sort of like walk us through your experience over these past 4 or 5 months. Like, What do people need to understand about how this process has unfolded, what the hopes were for the PEB, and ultimately why workers are so dissatisfied with the PEB's reported recommendations?
Max, you did an excellent job right there of kind of laying out some of the history and the difficulties that we face in the railroad industry that a lot of people don't understand, because the majority of the unionized workforce does work under the National Labor Relations Act and the Railway Labor Act, or as the president of my Central Labor Council here, I think, is so eloquently deemed it, the Railway Anti-Labor Act, uh, being something that was written to prevent national rail strikes. And again, when I talk about 1980, when there was 45 carriers, if there was a dispute between the unions and the carriers and you struck one carrier, it didn't necessarily have national implications because there were other routes that freight could take. Now, through these mergers and acquisitions where we pared that down and the remaining railroads bargain as a unit, they have very craftily positioned themselves to shield themselves from a national strike. And it's made it very difficult for us to fight and go forward. But particularly, as you say, within the last 4 to 5 months, um, there's been a lot of talk, and as we've come down to getting closer and closer to self-help, and the employees are paying more attention to it, about what are we going to get? We're looking to get a better contract, because our last couple of contracts really have not been anything to shout about. They haven't been that great. And the problem that dovetails into the problem with your retention and hiring employees too, is that these railroad CEOs, for as much as they see that they pay us and everything, don't realize those wages are not that competitive in this market anymore. um, and and so there really needs to be a change in the thinking there. But in the last 4 to 5 months, people have looked at what the carriers are proposing, what the unions are proposing. There's been hopes, in terms of our pay raises, in terms of what the effect's going to be on our healthcare. But again, what it's come down to, I think, more than anything else, is the working conditions and these draconian attendance policies that these railroads have uh, come up with, that limit our time off and prevent us from taking time off. And a lot of the world doesn't realize that probably 70% of our members work on call 24/7, 365, where they may have some idea of when they're going to work, but there's no certainty in that. It's an entirely different world when we work out here, and the demands of this job, and the amount of time that you spend away. I mean, literally on my daughter's 20th birthday, I looked at her standing almost eye to eye to me and thought, when did this happen? And then I realized, oh yeah, well, I was out working to pay for it. That's life on the railroad. And it's come to the point now where I think the workforce that is here, we've got a younger workforce. A lot of the workers that were around, um, when things were a lot different, have retired now. We've got this younger workforce and new coming in, and they're looking at these working conditions, saying this isn't acceptable. Something's got to change. And particularly when they clamp that screw down and make it to the point to where, as our national president has pointed out, people are getting disciplined for going to the doctor, for taking off sick when they've got COVID, or have serious health conditions or something. This is ridiculous. It's got to stop. And again, this is where I think the membership is at, that we were really hoping to see some change on that. And when it didn't get addressed at the PEB, uh, there was a lot of disappointment there. But also, I think we need to look at the one thing that's really gone viral, and that you've probably heard here, was something that was contained on page 32 of the PEB's report. And that being a summation of remarks that were made by the carriers representatives, saying that labor and the workers don't contribute to their profits. Their profits are the result of investment and risk. And since we don't share in the downside risk, we shouldn't be expect to share in the upside risk either. That was an irresponsible, reckless statement made there, and that's really what's inflamed the membership right now. So at a time when we're already dealing with a personnel shortage and how we serve that, now you've just alienated your entire workforce. And furthermore, uh, when potential new people hear that that's what these companies think about their workers, are they really going to be motivated to come in and work for companies they know that that's what they think of them? That was really a foolish statement to make. And as I said, if there's anything really that's driving the membership now against the carriers, it was that kind of attitude that they displayed there. And I was at a convention here a couple of weeks ago where I had the good fortune to talk with a labor attorney from here in Nevada who's done a lot of work with us in lobbying at the legislature and addressing a lot of things in labor. The firm that he works for now is representing the maintenance away employees. And he spoke to me repeatedly. He was there at these hearings, and he just spoke to me repeatedly about how repulsive it was to sit in that room and listen to the disdain these people showed for their employees. When you're already uh, in a worker shortage and you're trying to recruit people, how does projecting that kind of attitude publicly help out? It doesn't. And again, I think it's just another display of the incompetence of the management of these railroads and what they're doing here that's bringing about all these problems, your labor problems, your service problems, all of it.
Right. I mean, again, just for folks watching and listening, right? Think of what Matt just described, right? All the moments with your family lost, right? All the time spent away from home, all of the stress, the psychological stress, the emotional stress that it takes on a person to be on call 24/7 year round, right? To have no sick days, right? To get penalized, in fact, by draconian attendance policies for taking time off to go see the doctor, right? To already be squeezed that much by a company, to then be told in a presidential emergency board report that Matt was referring to, the line from that infamous page 32 states as follows, quote, the carriers, again, these are the companies that the major companies that run the freight services. The carriers maintain that capital investment and risk are the reasons for their profits, not any contributions by labor, right? And I completely understand why workers have felt that was such a slap to the face when they have been sacrificing so much, when they have been facing so many staff cuts and being told to do more with less, so on and so forth. Also, having worked to keep the supply chain going through a global pandemic, right? It really does, yeah, articulate, as you said, a pure disdain or and disregard for the workers who make the railroads run. And I think that what's coming through in what you're saying, Matt, what has come through in all the reporting that we've done here at the Real News and all the folks that I've been speaking to off, recording, is that contrary to what corporate media may be saying right now, because corporate media doesn't know how to talk about labor struggles. And when they do, they usually only cite, the corporation side of things. But they are, front loading the fact that the Presidential Emergency Board recommendations do recommend a significant wage increase for workers, but also uncaps healthcare costs. It doesn't touch the meal per diem that workers are supposed to have, because they spend so much time away, and oftentimes they are taking money out of their own pocket just to feed themselves, even though those expenses should be covered or at least deductible on their taxes. So, these are also things that workers have been kind of pointing out about the wage factor, right? It's not just about a wage increase, but it's about a wage increase that, a lot is going to get eaten up by inflation, more could potentially get eaten up by uncapped healthcare costs, so on and so forth. But the thing that folks keep emphasizing is that this ultimately isn't really about money. It's about the working conditions. It's about the quality of life for people working on the railroads, given everything that we're talking about here. So, with the remaining time that I have with you, and I know we gotta wrap this up. I was wondering if we could kind of talk about how that is all playing out in the conversations that rank and file workers are having this week as we approach the deadline after which strikes and lockouts can begin. I guess, for can you just give us a sense of what you're hearing, what you're feeling, and what folks out there should be looking out for?
Well, again, overwhelmingly, what I'm seeing is it's about the working conditions, and I'd like to share with you a little bit of a personal story here. My wife passed away last October as a result of complications from COVID. She was in the hospital for 25 days, and during that time, as the sole provider for our household, I still had to go to work. I still had to get on trains and take them out of town, working under federal regulations where I cannot have my cell phone on, so I'm out of communication, and I'm going away, and I'm not knowing if when I get to the other end of the terminal or the other end of the run, I'm going to turn my phone on and have a message from the hospital that her health is worsened or that she's passed away. How safe do you feel knowing that engineers and conductors are going to work and bearing that kind of burden? Um, but and ultimately, when she did pass away, it was by the grace of God, not by the grace of the railroad, that I was able to be here holding her hand as she passed away. And these arrogant, out of touch CEOs have the audacity to tell me that I don't share in a downside risk. We've lost three. We've seen the lives lost of three brothers within the last 2 weeks in accidents, and several more injured. And they say we bear no downside risk. I just attended a fundraising event over the weekend for a maintenance away brother who lost both of his legs in an accident in July, and they say we bear no downside risk. This is what people need to understand. People who don't work outside the railroad is that the difference in what we do when we're away, when we go away from homes, it's kind of a joke, but there's a lot of truth to it too. That the worst stuff in your life is going to happen while you're at the other end of the run. When your spouse or your family's calling you up and there's some disaster at home, maybe one of your kids got hurt doing something or something. It always happens when you're away. That's the reality that we live in. That's what we do every day to move freight in this country. And we deserve a lot more respect and consideration than what we're getting here. These policies that don't let people take time off to take a break from this, to be with their families and everything, it's unreasonable. It's out of control. It's got to be addressed. And again, this from my perspective is what I see is the main sticking point right now, and why the railroad workers are willing to stand their ground here and go out on strike, because they want respect. They want to be treated like human beings. They want to be treated reasonably and have a reasonable quality of life. And the rail carriers have had an adversarial relationship with their workers clear back to the beginning of the industry in the 1800s. We're living in a different world now. Anybody who's got half a brain and everything can see just the changes that we've seen in societal attitudes in the last 4 years. These guys are still stuck in the 1800s, and this is what they're trying to impose and making us live under. And this is the sticking point. This is why the workers are fed up and standing their ground and demanding a change.
Hell yeah. And I mean, thank you for sharing that with us, man. And I can't even begin to say how sorry I am that you went through that, and that we're sending all of our love and solidarity to you and to everyone working on the railroads enduring this crap. And, I guess with the final kind of minutes that I have you here, again, I know that by the time this video comes out, near the end of the week, close to the deadline, things may very well change. There are a number of options that scenarios that could unfold. Again, Congress is already thinking about issuing a back to work order, forcing workers to accept the PEB as the framework for a new tentative agreement. Perhaps the cooling off period could be extended, and a new round of mediations or negotiations could happen. We'll see. But I guess I wanted to sort of ask you, to let listeners and viewers know, um, what could happen this week. Like, what would it look like if the deadline is passed and strikes and or lockouts begin? And what can folks out there do to show solidarity with you and your fellow workers on the railroads?
It's a big question mark, and we really don't know, because it's, as it's been pointed out, neither side is committed to anything. The unions have taken strike votes and their members have authorized strikes. Have they set a deadline? No. Have the railroads said that they're going to lock us out at 12:01 a.m.? No. As you pointed out, they've already kind of started a soft lockout, and are embargoing shipments and closing intermodal gates and such. I've asked around and I can't find anybody who could tell me in any time previous where these steps have been taken by the railroads. We've still got, the rest of the week before this comes up, and already they're starting to shut down. If we started walking off the job today, uh, we could be prosecuted under the law for doing that. But these carriers are just choosing on their own to start shutting down operations in anticipation of what they expect is a work stoppage. What we need is for people to understand where we're coming from and understand that this is probably less of a pay issue and a benefits issue than, again, the quality of life issue. The quality of life. I mean, if you go to your doctor and ask him about the most unhealthy lifestyle that you could possibly live, that's pretty much how we live in the realm that we're at when we're on call, as I said, 24/7, 365, never knowing when we're going to go to work, not necessarily being able to get good meals all the time and such. But this is what we do, and it's time to address. This is not the 1800s anymore. It's time for us, as we're called essential workers, to be treated that way, to have a decent quality of life, to have the respect of our employers, and that's why Congress needs to. We would prefer stay out of this and let us hash it out with the carriers, and if that means strike or lockout, so be it. Honestly, I'd like to see a strike or a lockout just because I'm curious. I think it may be 2 or 3 days before anybody really notices. That's how bad service has gotten on the rails right now. Beyond that, it might be a problem, but it could actually take time because the way things are running here. Last week, we had a train that was experienced a locomotive failure. It sat out on the desert for 2 days before they moved it. There's no reason for that. That's just incompetent management. But this is what's going on all the time. So really, would anybody notice right away? It'd be kind of interesting to find out. But again, understand the quality of life, why it's such an issue with us, why that's really what we're fighting for here, and press Congress, to let this run its course and let us hash it out with the carriers and try to get some improvement that's way overdue for us. Or if they're going to step into it, to do so very cautiously, because again, as I pointed out, we're seeing workers today leave this industry in numbers voluntarily that we've never seen before, just because they're fed up. And in terms of replacing those workers and recruiting new workers and everything, if we don't address these quality of life issues, hiring and retention is going to be a problem in the future. And that's really what we need to be focused on here, is making those improvements so we make sure we have the workers. Without this being addressed, the real emergency here might not come on Friday. It could come six months, a year, two down the road, when there simply is no workforce and they can't get the workforce because people don't want to do this work under the kind of conditions we do it for. So understand that and just be supportive of us, and understand what it is that we're fighting for, have our backs, and put pressure on these lawmakers. If they're going to intervene, to do it wisely, or they could well end up being part of the problem in the long run.
So that is Matt Parker, a full time locomotive engineer who's been working on the railroads for 19 years. Matt is also serving part time as chairman of the Nevada State Legislative Board of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
And Max, thank you again for having me.
And for all of you watching, this is Maximilian Alvarez. Before you go, please head on over to therealnews.com/donate. Become a monthly sustainer of our work so we can keep bringing you important coverage and conversations just like this, because corporate media won't. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and stand in solidarity with our fellow workers on the railroads. Thank you so much for watching.